very bright. Thank you all for so much for coming. I think most people of you're familiar with this space here, but in case you're not, there's bathrooms across the hall, there's a water fountain in the hallway. After 9 o'clock, you cannot go out this door any longer. The door that you came in is an emergency exit, so you will set off the alarm. So now, as it's after 9, you have to go in and out the front door. So my name is Libby, and I'm who coordinates these workshops, and I will have my contact information for you later on in the day, should you need to be in touch with me about anything. If you have not signed in already, please do so, particularly if you're receiving CEU credit. Everyone should have an evaluation, and I do need that back at the end of the day if you're getting a CEU certificate from me. I think that's it for housekeeping stuff. I think anyone who's been doing addiction work or human service work in this area probably already knows Jeep, as he's got himself very well established in his expertise. But we're really excited to have him, so I hope you all enjoy your workshop.
Thanks, Libby.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. For the people that just stopped in, please sign in at the back there and put on a name tag and welcome. You don't have to worry about being a minute late. Everyone will survive. And thanks again, Libby. So I'm GP Zurenda. I'm a psychiatric social worker. I do a lot of work with alcohol and drug issues. It's not the only thing that I do, but as time goes by, it seems to take up a larger and larger percentage of my time. And the good news is that I love doing it, so it's not a problem. These are the goals of the training today, and take a look at them now, and when you're doing your evaluation at the end, one of the things we're going to want to do is figure out how close I came to covering the projected goals, and hopefully we'll get through most of it. I have a few extra slides that we may not get to towards the end, and that's okay. It's not going to detract from the learning. I am curious how many people that are here today have spent a fair amount of time studying 12-step stuff or going to open 12-step meetings, things like that. Has anybody done that? So, okay, there's some people that are familiar with 12-step stuff. That's great. And if you're not, I'm going to be mostly presenting as if you don't know the 12-step stuff. And I'm going to be giving a lot of background and history along with sort of my view of how the 12-step paradigms and language either equate or compare with cognitive behavioral therapy concepts and techniques and practices. So we're going to try and discuss how we evaluate, motivate, and treat people in various phases of addiction. When we're doing that, we have to adjust for their personalities, basically where they're at a given time. I'm going to provide an overview of 12-step concepts and what goes on in meetings and with sponsors and everything like that. We'll be using the 12-step language and translating it into other languages. And we're going to be identifying the various aspects of CBT in the program and the fellowship. And what I'm hoping is that you're going to see that a lot of the work that you're doing in your practices, pretty much regardless of what your theoretical bases are, that there's a lot of parallels between the language you're using and the techniques and theories you're using and what happens in the 12-step arena. Now, what I'm presenting is sort of my opinion and view of this rather than anything that's coming out of any 12-step text or anything like that. And if you talk to people that go to 12-step meetings, they may not relate at all to what I'm saying, or they may relate very closely to it depending on their personalities and what meetings they've gone to and who they've hung out with and what things other than 12-step stuff they've been reading since they got into recovery. So cognitive behavioral theory, you all have a handout on your desk that gives an official definition of of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think I will read it. Mine is, it's both a theory and a technique. It utilizes education and behavioral changes to help a person develop new insights, awareness, self-talk, a critical concept, interpersonal skills, relationships, competencies, and life skills, leading to positive changes in feelings and self-regard. Matter of fact, I won't read this. You can all read it. That's what we're doing with cognitive behavioral therapy. When I start with clients, what I tell them, they say, what do you do? And I say, what I do is cognitive behavioral therapy. The cognitive part is you get some education and some insights. The behavioral part is if you're eating too much sugar, you stop eating sugar. That's a behavioral change. A similar behavioral change for the drinker would be, instead of going to bars, going to 12-step stuff. That would be a behavioral change. But what we're after with cognitive behavioral therapy, what we're after is a change of feelings. Now, the problem with feelings is we don't get to choose them, and we don't get to choose to change them. But we can influence our feelings over time by how we think, how we talk to ourselves, how we interact with ourselves and others. So what we're doing with cognitive behavioral therapy, what's happening in the 12-step environment, is people's feelings are influenced in a positive direction over time. And the rate of change and the way that looks varies significantly person to person and with the same person, depending on what's going on. So that's what we're trying to do. The handout is more explicit in this, but it's congruent with what I was saying. So what we're trying to do, educate using theories, concepts, and themes. So whatever your theory base is, and I don't have psychoanalytic there, but that fits fine too. One of the things that's happened over the past 40 years or so is we've been working diligently to stop blaming everything on mom. And I think that that's a good thing. But whatever your conceptualization is, that when you're working with people, you're going to find aspects of that in the 12-step, what they call the program, and the fellowship. It may be obscure, but it's there. So the goal, as far as I'm concerned, when I'm working with people, I want my clients to be higher functioning and happier than they've been. And we want that improvement to continue forever. So the idea of, as far as I'm concerned, of the therapy that we're doing is we're helping people identify things that aren't going well in their life and helping them move those things, change those things so that life is going better, and then they're able to maintain that change. And that is a very key thing, the maintenance of the change. How do we do that? And one of the reasons, if any of you have any friends that are in this thing they call recovery, that they've been sober, they've been off drugs for 10 or 20 years, and they're still going to 12-step meetings, and people, why do you still go? Well, it's sort of like going to the gym. If you go to the gym for a year, and you have a trainer and you work out, at the end of the year, you're going to be in pretty good shape. But if you stop going to the gym after a year and you stop working out, after a few more years, you're no longer in shape. So the idea is to do what you need to do so that you can get into a lifestyle that works and maintain it. So I'm going to tell you a story. I tell a lot of stories when I'm working with people, and this is one of my favorites. This is the marathon runner's story, and it is a metaphor for what we're trying to do as therapists and what happens in a 12-step setting. So there's this gal. She's been sitting on the couch for the last 5 years, eating donuts and watching TV. And one day when she was watching TV, she sees a woman running a marathon. She goes, I want to do that. Well, if she were to get up off the couch and try and run 26.2 miles, she would hurt herself. I don't care how much of a natural athlete she is, if she's been sitting on the couch for 5 years eating donuts, She's not going to be able to make it 26.2 miles, and if she really tries hard, she'll probably never run again because it'll really be damaging. But if she gets up off the couch and she puts down the donuts, and she gets a good pair of running shoes and a book on how to run, and she starts walking, just walking, every day walking, and she continues to walk. Unless she has some health problem that I don't know about, there's a real good chance that after a few weeks, several weeks, she's going to be able to jog a couple miles. And if she keeps at it for several more weeks, there's a real good chance that she's going to be able to do 5 miles. And by the time she gets to being able to do 5 miles, 2 miles will be easy. And there's a good chance that she won't even remember on the first day she could barely walk 200 yards. But by the time she gets to distance, by the time she gets up to running a couple miles, it's going to become more and more important that she stretch. If she doesn't stretch, she's going to hurt herself. Might even be a good idea to join one of those running groups they have. They have them around Ithaca, and you can make some friends, you can get some pointers on how to run, maybe find some people to run with. Good idea. Maybe even get a coach. And a good coach is going to treat everybody as an individual. A good coach is going to be able to see who needs to be motivated to stretch and who needs to be stood over day after day and retaught how to stretch because they just can't get it. Now let's say that you're this gal and you've gotten to the point where you're running 8 or 10 miles and you're running down the road. One of your buddies pulls up in her car and she goes, "Hey Sue, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm training for the New York Marathon." "Well, cool. How do you like training?" "I hate it. I hate getting up early. I hate stretching. My coach is a jerk, but when I cross that finish line, I'm going to be pumped. It's worth it." That Sue can get to New York. She can cross the finish line, but she's going to be miserable for the next 1.5 or 2 years while she trains because she's into the goal. There's this other Sue. She's running down the road. She's doing 8 or 10 miles. Her buddy pulls up and says, "Hey, Sue, what's happening?" "I'm training for the New York Marathon." "How do you like training?" "It's mixed. I twisted my ankle the other day. I didn't care for that much. But, I'm putting on some muscle, I've dropped some weight, I've got more energy, my boyfriend thinks I'm hot. I don't even know if I'm going to run a marathon. But I'm going to keep doing this thing that I'm doing." Now that Sue can get to New York and she can cross the finish line too. But she's going to enjoy the next 1.5 or 2 years while she's training because she's into the process of change. So you get to New York and you cross the finish line, you are a marathon runner. And they'll give you a document that says you're a marathon runner, what place you came in, how long it took. You can frame it, you can hang it on the wall, you're a marathon runner. But if you go home from New York and you sit down on the couch, whether you pick up the donuts or not, you just sit down on the couch, you start watching TV. You stop working out, you stop exercising, you stop training. There is going to come a point in time, and you're not even likely to know when that point in time is, but there's going to come a point in time when you are no longer a marathon runner. So the idea of therapy and the idea of the 12-step programs is to facilitate a life change that is profound, and it affects a person in all the different areas of life, the physical area, the mental area, and the 12-step people would say their spiritual area. And then the idea is to maintain it forever. And that is one of the reasons that people after 15, 20 years continue to go, is because there's just like working out physically, there's maintenance required. And what you're doing in your first month or your third month or your first year would be different than what you're doing in 10 years, but there's still some stuff that you need to do so that you have a lifestyle that works well for you, so that you can, in large part, experience the positive feelings you once got from your obsessive compulsive behaviors. You get them other ways that work better. Now, I have 2 footnotes for this story. Your friends that saw you running down the road when you were doing 8, 10 miles, when they saw you running down the road, in all likelihood, unless they're skilled athletes themselves and reasonably insightful, in all likelihood what they'd be thinking is, there's Sue running down the road. there's no reason that what they'd be thinking is, there's Sue and she is acquiring knowledge, skills, competencies, capacities, and healthy discipline. When people actually sort of show up and really start participating in the 12-step stuff, when they drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, what happens is they are starting to acquire knowledge, skills, competencies, capacities, and healthy discipline. And if any of those 5 things are missing, they're not that likely to be successful in the life change that they're after. And that, the people that are not therapists, and actually a lot of therapists, people that are not in recovery, have no reason to be thinking that way or to intuit what goes on for people as they begin the process of quitting drugs or quitting drinking or quitting compulsive sex or food issues, all these things that so many of us wrestle with. But that's what's going on for somebody that needs to quit using because it's not working. And the second footnote is for the people that I work with, and ideally for everybody, I want them, when you are if you're this metaphorical runner and you've gotten to the point where you can do 2 miles or 5 miles, and your goal is 26.2, I want you being happy that you're doing 2 miles. I want you being happy that you're doing 5 miles. I am not interested in helping people develop new ways to be failures, new ways to not being good enough. A lot of our addictions have to do with not being good enough. Some people specialize in fear, some people in shame or guilt, but a lot of it is this thing that basically, I will be okay when. When I get to 26.2 miles, then I'll be good enough. When I get to 20 miles, I'll be good enough to, yeah, I can do 5 miles, but I should have started doing this 5 years ago, so I'm still a loser. The idea of this work and this change for people is for people to actually accept themselves and be good enough where they are, rather than having their well-being, their okayness, sometime in the future and conditional on being different or better. So knowledge, skills, competencies, capacities, and healthy discipline. And I'm good. I'm good here and now. I'm good. I'm walking a mile. I'm good. That's a lot better than sitting on the couch eating donuts. I'm walking a mile. That's good. And I'm going to get up and I'm going to keep at it tomorrow. And that's what we're going for in what they call recovery. Yeah.
Are you going to be at some point during the day going into some ideas on how to help people move towards?
Yes.
Good.
A lot. I will from a couple different models.
Great.
And the 12-step people do that. I'll jump way ahead. If you go to the 12-step meetings, they often have little signs on the walls with slogans and stuff like that. One of their slogans is one day at a time. And they started putting that on the wall back in the 30s or the 40s. And the way I think about that one day at a time slogan is that translates to be here now. They developed the awareness back then. Somebody intuited, they had the insight that it's not the troubles of today that cause people to relapse. It's the anticipation of it's always going to be like this. I am always going to be this depressed. It's always, my boss is always going to be this much of a jerk, or my spouse, or my parents, or my kids, or whomever. And it's that living in the future and the past that causes people to use initially, to begin with. And then is what causes people to relapse. So this be here now thing is very, very important, and developing the techniques is difficult and obscure. So yeah, I will bring that up. So a little background on AA for those of you that haven't been exposed to it. AA is the first of the many 12-step groups. And there are hundreds of different 12-step organizations these days, along with Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous and al-anon and nar-anon. Al-anon and nar-anon are for loved ones that have people that are addicted. There's also Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Food Addicts Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, Debtors Anonymous, and et cetera. So there's a lot. They're all based on the same 12 steps with a couple words changed for the appropriate, change the alcohol to drugs or to gaming or to sex. But the underlying concepts are basically the same with one caveat, and that is that for people that wrestle with food issues and sex issues also, is you can't become abstinent. The original 12-step programs were all abstinent-based. They were abstinent-based because everybody tried desperately to drink or to do drugs successfully to moderate, to be okay, and they couldn't figure out how to do it. So that's where the abstinence base came from. With food, you have to eat. Most of us like to have sexual relationships that work, so that's not the ultimate goal for those programs. So it's more difficult. It's a lot easier to totally abstain from whatever the problem behavior or substance is than it is to moderate it. But Bill Wilson was one of the AA co-founders. He was a stockbroker. He made a fair amount of money, then he lost it, and he was drinking a lot before that, which wasn't as bad a problem because he was making a lot of money, and it was a big problem when he wasn't. In 1935 and 34, Bill went into a few detoxes, rehab type things that they had at those times. They're mostly more mental institution types, but he spent a lot of time at a place called Towns Hospital in New York City. When he had about 6 months not drinking, he had been trying to help other people, but he was in Akron, Ohio on business. The business was going poorly. He was in a hotel. He was in a lobby. There was a bar next to the lobby, and he had the awareness that if he didn't find someone to help, he was going to drink. And that's how he met the co-founder of AA, Dr. Bob Smith, who was a proctologist in Akron. And Bill went and chatted with Bob, and that led to a lifelong friendship. After a few months of struggling, Bob got sober, and as June, the last time he had a drink. Interestingly, the last time he had a drink was 4 days after a bender, and he was about to go do surgery, and they gave him a beer on the way to the hospital to make sure he didn't get the shakes. That was his last drink, and that's his founding date, June 10th, 35. The third AA member was a lawyer, so we were covering a lot of ground here with a stockbroker, a doctor, and a lawyer. Most of the early AA members were white middle-class men, and I think the term recovering is and was very accurate for them in the sense that they had all pretty much without exception early on. They had all finished high school, many had finished college. They had had some degree of success in their fields, and then they crashed and burned from drinking. And with all that goes with that, with the wrecked homes and marriages and financial problems and things like that. AA early on had to address a lot of issues that we're still wrestling with now. The first time a woman showed up at a meeting, they had to have a discussion, do we let women in? And there was concern about doing that because they were afraid that their wives would no longer let them participate because everyone knew what a problem alcoholic women are. And so they had a debate, and they said, we have to let them in or they're going to die. That's how women got in. Same thing happened with blacks. There have been AA meetings in the South and in Washington, D.C. Since the early 40s. And same thing, we have to let them in, they're going to die. Same thing with Native Americans. The first female that had long-term sobriety, Marty Mann, was a lesbian. And that was known to Bill and Bob, who were fairly Christian and relatively conservative. It's like, yeah, everybody is welcome. Come on in. And Marty Mann, by the way, lectured all over the country and started the NIAAA. It's had a very big influence on addiction and treatment in this country. And she was a very early proponent of these things and actually helped get the AMA to declare alcoholism a disease rather than a moral issue. So AA started small. It started in Dr. Bob's kitchen and in a townhouse in New York City. Third meeting was in Cleveland. And then as people left towns, moved to this and that, the meetings were set up. The organization got its name from its book. It wrote the book, Alcoholics, Bill and Bob and 100 Drunk Salesmen. Wrote the big book, what's called the big book, in 1939, and then the organization drew its name from the title of the book. Prior to that, it had no name. It actually came, to a large degree, out of what's called the Oxford Group, which was a British evangelical Christian organization. And they were very helpful to the drunks, but eventually the Oxford people got sick of the drunks, and the drunks got sick of the Oxford people, and they had a pretty happy splitting of the ways. Now it's reported, they do a survey every 5 years in AA of the membership and how long people have been sober, and that's about the best source for stats, because there's not been as much research done on 12-step stuff as one might expect. But they figure there's a couple million members of AA, and then there's all the other 12-step groups which have millions of members also. And about 50% of the people in AA have 5 years or more of recovery. There's a huge relapse rate for people as they're starting it. It confounds a lot of the numbers, because people that come in, they get a month, they get 6 months or a year, and they go back out and drink are often regarded as failures. And the fact that a lot of them come back in 6 months or a year or 5 years later and stay sober forever, it confounds the numbers. But that's where it comes from. Interestingly, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had a huge positive impact on AA. He was living in New York, and the early AA members, and particularly Bill Wilson, had fairly large egos. And he was fairly well connected. He'd been successful at one time. And they connected with John D's right-hand man, a gentleman named Richardson. Rockefeller set up a dinner for early AA members and their wealthy friends to talk about this organization. And the early AAs had dreams of building hospitals and treatment centers all over the world and saving all the drunks. And John D., who was a teetotaling Baptist and always had been, as was his father, was very interested and liked the idea and set up these meetings and assigned Mr. Richardson to actually, Richardson stayed on the board of trustees of AA until he passed away. But the interesting thing is after the efforts to raise money, Rockefeller said, money will ruin this thing. And he said, he actually gave Bill and Bob a little stipend to help them survive for a few years. But he said, don't ever have professionals, don't ever acquire money or property. And one of the AA is a 12-step program, has the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. What they say is the 12 steps keep the alcoholic from killing him or herself, and the traditions keep them from killing each other. And so one of the traditions of AA is the no professionals, and another is to have no property or big bank accounts, which I think has been very helpful. So they've ended up with no gurus. At least a lot of towns will have a guru, an old timer or two that everybody defers to, sometimes in a helpful way, sometimes not so helpful. But there's nobody in AA or members or on the board that are making hundreds of thousands of dollars or having a yacht and a mansion on the island. So that sort of started, and it just grew out of that. The big book got caused a lot of growth to happen. Actually, one of the biggest purchasers of the book Alcoholics Anonymous is the military. They've bought millions of copies. But it started by word of mouth, people traveling to other cities, and finally what caused it to grow is they say that all you need to start an AA meeting is two people, a resentment, and a coffee pot. And to a large degree, that's how AA grew. People got upset with the people they were meeting with, and they went down the street to another church, and they started another meeting, and oftentimes everybody made out fine. Sometimes the meetings that were less healthy atrophied and went away. So, how and why do clients come to us? They come of their own volition, or they're sent by their parent, spouse, partner, boss, the judge, the lawyer, the children, etc. This is especially true if alcohol and drugs are involved. How many people here treat many people with substance abuse disorders? Okay, so quite a few. So you get some people that come in sent from the judge or their lawyer? Yeah, or mom or dad, the husband or the wife. Yeah, and now sometimes they're coming because they're really being pushed and they really don't want to be there. Sometimes it's sort of half and half. And sometimes it's like, thank God that this terrible thing happened because I'm ready and I've just been lying to myself. But they also come in, they may have a substance abuse problem, and this is a big problem with the split between the mental health field and the substance abuse field, is people will come into a therapist with a very real problem with depression, a very real problem with anxiety, sometimes with more significant issues and diagnoses. But that's not at all uncommon. And oftentimes they're simply treated for anxiety or depression, and oftentimes that's with meds, some of which are really helpful and some of which are problematic, particularly if you have substance abuse tendencies. So they come in with work issues and relationships issues, and often because unreasonable people sent them, including bosses, spouses, and judges. When we meet with people with substance abuse problems, like the good coach from the marathon runner metaphor, we have to be very attuned to treating them as individuals and not as, oh, there's a drunk, there's a drug addict, there's someone with an eating disorder. There, you know, everybody is very different, and it's very important. And we have to know that even in the context where their own terminal uniqueness is killing them. And anybody here that's worked with addicts has heard the explanations for why they may occasionally drink or drug too much. You know, if you had my life, you'd drink too. You know, if you had my boss, you'd be smoking pot every day. As a matter of fact, you'd smoke on the way in, and then you'd smoke at lunchtime, and then of course you'd have to smoke a little so you could go to sleep, but it's just really just, you know, it's nothing bad. So we need to be attuned, and we need to shift our approach depending on how they're self-identifying. Whether they're identifying as having a serious problem, as identifying as maybe having a problem, or identifying it's everybody else that has a problem. So otherwise we're going to lose them. The development of rapport is absolutely critical to be highly successful when dealing with people with substance abuse issues. One of the reasons 12-step programs work is because people that have a history of shooting heroin, people that have a history of drinking too much, have a tendency to relate to people that have been there, much more so than they have a tendency to relate to people that come as, I am the professional and you are the problem, or you are the person with the problem. Sometimes this issue is driven by guilt and shame. Sometimes it's driven by ego, but the development of rapport is saying, you know, welcome. You know, I relate to you, I get you, I don't regard you as bad. Now, sometimes you speak those words. More often it's a feeling that you put off so that people have a tendency to feel safe and welcome in your office. They have a tendency to feel that you actually have a chance of being helpful rather than simply check the boxes that is required from the probation department or their spouse or parent or boss, and they can outlast you. So getting started. So how people present and the goals they choose determines the approach and content of early sessions. To a large extent, this is what separates therapists' approaches from a 12-step approach. I put that in there because, and it's in one of the lines of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. They say, if you're trying to help someone and they're not buying in, they're not being willing to do what's recommended or what needs to be done, they say, let them go and go find somebody else to help, which was a very reasonable thing. Bill Wilson, like the first 50-some people he tried to help, it was to no avail until he got to Dr. Bob. But the purpose of 12-step programs is not to proselytize or convert people who are not interested in quitting drinking or drugging or whatever. The purpose of 12-step stuff is to help those that are interested in being helped. Now, as professionals, we have a little higher bar. One of our jobs is when people come in and say, I've got anxiety, is to do an effective evaluation and say, yeah, you do have anxiety, and it may have something to do with all the crack you're smoking. Or it may have to do with what happens when you start running out of whatever it is, whether it's booze or pot or whatever. And so it's up to us to do an effective evaluation and help this person even if their understanding of their problem is not accurate. And so that separates us from the whole 12-step shtick, is we are much more likely to be dealing with people who are, pre-committed to recovery. They know something's not right, and they want to feel better. And if it's substances, and this is also through the people I've worked with that have compulsive sex issues and gaming issues and gambling and shopping issues, the language they use and the way they talk, you'd think you were talking to a late-stage alcoholic or somebody who's been using heroin for a long time as far as their behaviors and the intensity of their self-loathing and often their depression and despair. So this is important stuff. So what we have to do as professionals is take that identification with anxiety or depression or craziness or everyone being difficult in their life and reasonably accurately, try and get a sense of what else is going on and try and, once again, going back to the CBT model, educate the person about the rest of the story. Now, there's some people in here that are old enough to remember Paul Harvey. Yeah, okay, yeah, there's hasn't. So Paul Harvey was a radio guy. He did like human interest news stories. So there'd be this little human interest news blurb, and then Paul, and that's the story. And this is Paul Harvey with the rest of the story. A lot of what we're doing with our clients is giving them the rest of the story, is shifting them off the conversation that they've had with themselves for an indeterminate period of time about the nature of their problems and filling in the blanks and reframing the conversation they have so what they're saying to themselves is more accurate and more complete. Without that, we're not likely to get where we want to go. And once again, this can take a long time. So different presenting types. They're aware of their addiction and they want help. So these are the people, they quite often they've already been to outpatient treatment or sometimes inpatient, sometimes both, sometimes many times. They very likely can quote the what they call the big book better than you can. And they know all the lingo, but they don't have it here yet. And that needs to change. Some are in that space. They've had no education and they've had no previous experience. So they're going to be more open than other people that you get, and giving them as much education you can in a short period of time in a way that's palatable is going to have a huge influence, even if you only see them once. She is unsure if there's really a problem. I get a lot of clients that are in this situation. You'll see this a lot with high school kids, college kids, people in their young 20s. I couldn't possibly have a problem. Yeah, I cracked up a car. Yeah, I got arrested. Yeah, I OD'd. But I think I can work this out. I can get it under control. Now, with these people, a lot of what I do, how many are familiar with the term harm reduction? Okay. Now, this is a confusing term these days because it's used for a couple different, from a societal standpoint and an individual standpoint. And I'm talking about harm reduction in the individual standpoint. And so one of the things that people, if you're up at IC or you're up at Cornell and kids come in and they've had a bad weekend, they've been missing classes on Monday or whatever, you talk to them about harm reduction, get them to put a limit on the number of days they drink and how much they're going to drink or how much they're smoking or whatever. It can be very helpful. And it can be very helpful for two reasons, and the second reason is often ignored, and the second reason is critical. The first reason it can be very helpful is if you educate people about developing their sense of limits, how much they can safely drink, what the effects of alcohol and drugs are in their body, they may in fact simply dial back what they've been doing. They may mature some, and they may not end up having a long-term problem. That's awesome. But if that's not the case, and they make a contract, and then they fail to maintain it, that's diagnostic. When people, and I should probably go into a little more detail first, when I do contracts with people, I do very specific written contracts, and I work very diligently to get the buy-in. And the buy-in has to do with the person that I'm talking to actually voluntarily choosing to do this contract rather than thinking they have to do it because I'm an authority figure or because they got sent here by their PO or something like that. Because without that buy-in, you're not going to get the benefits you want. So I do a written contract, very specific. How many days a week are you going to drink or smoke pot? Or both, and I'll have people that they like all sorts of drugs. And we go through a contract on each one. How many days, what days of the week. I did one with a gentleman yesterday. He's not going to drink one day of the week. On other days of the week, he's limiting it to a certain amount, and on Sundays he gets more. You need to be very specific. A lot of what we're doing with the contract is helping break through people's denial. There's self-talk that tells them the only reason I did such a stupid thing was bad luck or because I hadn't eaten or because I was tired or because somebody else was a jerk, rather than I drink more than I plan. And I drink to black out because I'm consuming a lot of booze rather than because I have bad luck. So you be very specific. And you also build in at the beginning before the contract starts. So, and by the way, I don't worry so much. The classic contract was 2 drinks, not more than 2 days in a row, not more than twice a week, not more than 2 days in a row. And that not more than 2 days in a row keeps people from being able to back up Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, or Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. I don't worry about keeping it limited to 2 drinks because if you have a problem with alcohol, if you have a problem with drugs, you're going to break the contract. There was a line in the AA Big Book in 1939. If you're unsure if you have a problem with alcohol, go out and try some controlled drinking. It may be worth a bad case of the shakes to determine if it's a problem. So this is not a brilliant new thing that we therapists came up with. They figured this out a long time ago by failing at it. But you want to be very specific. And then you have, what happens if I break the contract? So the first thing I put in, if you break this contract, you make a commitment to tell me on a timely basis. The second thing is that if you break the contract, you will agree at this time that at that time you will agree to further treatment. And I may early on say, abstinence for, I'll generally go at that point, abstinence for 3 months if you break it. Maybe one 12-step meeting, maybe 10, maybe 9, it depends on what I can get away with. And what we're doing is we're sort of setting up the path. It really is very similar to what comes out of EAP programs, of escalating sanctions with escalating offers of help. And so we do the contract and with all these stipulations, and they know what comes next. You know, if you make the contract with me next that you're going to be abstinent for 3 months and then you fail, you know, there's going to be further treatment. And so there's a lot of development of self-awareness of what's going on in this process. It's one of the things that's remarkable to me about this, because I've done a lot of these, is how many people call me up and say I broke it, or they come in and they're honest about what's going on. And you know, the thing is when we're dealing with people with these problems, there's a part of them that wants to change. And there's a part of them that desperately wants to figure out how to use successfully, because the alcohol and the drugs is the only thing that ever worked in their life. The only fun they ever had, the only absence of anxiety they ever had, the only diminishment of depression they ever had, the only time they ever talked to a girl or a guy was when they were using. And so they have this little thing going on inside, usually unconsciously, of I really can't drink with safety, but if I stop, my life is over. And that's a lot for us to overcome as therapists. And so we need to be sensitive to that. You know, there's not that many people who are, you know, coming back to my office a second or third or a 10th time that don't want to change, because I'm sort of a pain in the ass. But there's also a lot of people I work for a long time that are unable to stop or unable to stay stopped because of the pain. And sometimes it's the emotional pain, and sometimes it is this obsessive thought, that just this thing of I'm not okay. Yes? Yeah.
Just from a treatment protocol point of view, are you comfortable doing contracts with any type of drug?
No, not with opiates. Opiates, thank you for the question. You can't use opiates without getting dependent. And there really isn't anybody that becomes dependent. For the people that end up in my office, there's nobody that's been doing opiates for a while that also hasn't developed craving. If you have surgery and you're on opiates for a month, you're going to be dependent on opiates at the end of that month. And it's going to be beneficial for you to taper and get over it. The question mark is at the end of that taper or during the course of that taper, will you have developed craving? So not everyone that's dependent on opiates remains dependent on opiates or becomes long-term addicted, but the dependency is there. And the craving is the issue. There are other issues with it. The advent of a larger scale opiate addiction, it really, to talk about it properly, requires a little extra time, because with how quickly people become physiologically addicted has sort of changed the profile a little bit of addicts. And I think both in the oncoming aspects of the addiction, and also the treatment and the psychological and emotional issues involved. So thank you for that question. So the last is the people that are there, you know, either with or without antagonism. It can be interesting trying to get people over that, you know, I am the enemy type thing for people that are dragged in or sent. I get a lot of kids dragged into my office, you know, high school kids or college kids. You know, connecting with them and developing that rapport and shifting out of, you know, I am the authority and, you know, and you are the problem is really important, and it's doable. And you do it by connecting and letting them know that you have, you know, what I tell everybody is, I have nothing against drinking, or in fact, I don't have anything against doing drugs. But I tell them some people can't do it with safety. And part of what we're trying to figure out is, are you one of those people that can't do it with safety? Rather than this is a legal issue or a moral issue or an issue of character. That type of shift often opens people up to let go of some of the antagonism and start talking about their anxiety or their depression or they're being bullied at school or picked on or not knowing how to talk to girls or boys or whatever it is that led them to not be good enough, that led them to seek solace in substances. I just felt it was important to mention when I'm working with people, I don't do outpatient counseling with everyone, and I don't recommend AA as the solution to everyone. But as part of the assessment, I try and say, what are the risk factors going on with this person? My preference for dealing with people who have substance abuse issues is first outpatient, ideally with 12-step exposure. Most of the rehabs in this country, and not all of them, but 90-some%, have some sort of 12-step component to their treatment process. My experience is that people that are exposed to 12-step stuff prior to rehab have a higher success rate in rehab than people that just go, they come see me once, they go from my office inpatient at Tully Hill or Caron or someplace, because they're able to keep their defenses up for a longer period of time. Well, this is bullshit. I mean, all this God stuff, and they're able to keep the wall up and not much of anything gets in for a longer period of time, so the inpatient work is less effective. So my preference is come see me, maybe go to CARS or the council in addition to that, but I try and talk people in. I do something simple. I say, go to 6 AA meetings, go to 6 NA meetings. And I explain to them, I always tell them, make a commitment to go to 6 before you go to your first one. And they always look at me with like, what the hell does that mean? Is basically, what I say is, make a commitment that even if the first 5 meetings you go to suck, that you'll go to a 6th, because some 12-step meetings do suck, yeah. And in many different ways. And some of them are awesome and inspiring. Yeah, Jerry?
When you're saying go to 6 meetings, are you suggesting that they go to 6 different locations rather than just?
I do, yeah, I do recommend that they mix it up so they get different flavors and different personalities. And each 12-step meeting has its own personality and flavor that's dependent on the the particular members and what's going on in the lives of the particular members at a given time. So I explained to them it's a shame to waste a potential resource by going to one meeting and everybody's talking about God that day, and it's like, I hate God, and so, and go away. You go to a half a dozen meetings, you're more likely to get a more accurate feel for what's going on. And then I also tell them that if they were to, instead of following my suggestion, if they continue to use, they get in trouble, they crack up the car, they end up at Tully Hill, that they're going to be dropping $20,000 or so, and for a 4-week time there. And towards the end of that 4-week time, the rehab people are going to be doing what's called aftercare planning. And aftercare planning is about how do you stay sober when you're no longer in the safe environment. And one of the things they're going to be trying to talk them into is to going to 90 12-step meetings in 90 days. So I said, you can go to 6, you can pay me $50 and go to 6 meetings, or you can pay them $20,000 and they're going to tell you to go to 90. It's your choice. But part of why the rehabs do that is to get people more connected, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Footnote, we're going to stop for a break in about 15 minutes, and it's totally fine. Anybody needs to go to the restroom before then or get something. It's not going to upset me. So inpatient or outpatient, if I have a high school kid dragged in, he or she is drinking on weekends with friends, they're smoking pot more than their parents want, and which is quite often they'd prefer they're not smoking at all, but a lot of parents are a little more open-minded than that these days. I generally go the outpatient route. If they have major depression, if they're cutting, if they're getting drunk and stealing cars, if they're out trying to score dope at 2 in the morning, and or dealing drugs in ways that, they're dealing drugs and they're stiffing people for money, I'm more inclined to try and get people inpatient quicker. I often meet a lot of resistance on that. I've had a number of college students in the past few years that I wanted to pull right out of college in inpatient that day. Generally the parents say no. There's been a few of them that there's been a subsequent ride to the hospital in an ambulance, and then off to the hospital, or off to the rehab or the hospital or whatever. It's each time it's a judgment call. Sometimes the person leaves the office and I'm going, man, should I have done more? Is this a dangerous enough situation that I can break confidentiality? And that's tough things, and as therapists, we all have to deal with that at different times. Co-occurring disorders has a big impact on the choice of inpatient or outpatient, and the energy of focus on maybe encouraging somebody to go on to legally prescribed meds. Maybe encouraging people to change their legally prescribed meds, maybe encouraging people to go off their legally prescribed meds, depending on what I'm seeing. There are a whole lot of people that end up in my office that are grossly misdiagnosed. Many doctors aren't skillful around alcohol and drug issues. If you're smoking crack, you're going to be up and down like this. If you're in high school or college these days, you are going to, 9 out of 10 kids can tell any nurse practitioner, doctor, any prescriber, all these symptoms you need to have so you get ADD meds. And my experience is 80% of the people that are on ADD meds don't have ADD. And if they're inclined, if they're predisposed towards addiction, that can be the gateway to the addiction. There's a lot of other people that, because of their erratic behavior or moods, are diagnosed as bipolar, and they're not. They may have depression, they may have anxiety, but they're not bipolar, and the side effects of bipolar meds can be fairly significant and then confound things. They then switch doctors and they pick up a new diagnosis of a personality disorder, and by the time they get to me, they're on Seroquel and Abilify, and you don't know what has to do with what, how much of it is self-prescribed and how much it has to do with what's come from the doctors. And sometimes I've advocated that a person go inpatient to detox from all properly prescribed meds and start over with somebody that understands addiction. And then finally, of course, you want to look at suicidal ideations and behaviors. There's a lot of suffering out there in the world, and there are a lot of people that in recovery commit suicide. And I think it's surprising to a lot of people, but they started using because they have depression, and now they're not using and they still have depression, and they get, if this is all there is, and it either leads to relapse or a suicidal effort. Okay, so what we're doing when we're working to help people achieve long-term recovery. What we're doing is trying to help them identify and deal more competently and skillfully with major feelings, with fear, with anger, with resentment, anxiety, low self-esteem, shame, and guilt. This is lost on a lot of people. One of the reasons we want to have the rapport You have somebody come back in your office for the 6th time, they've relapsed, and they're a pain in the ass besides. And, you can feel anger coming on. It's like, wait a minute, this person is suffering. Now, I may not be the right person to help them, but they're generally not using at me, as a personal affront. And when I can be skillful, I can remember to not go into that place of how bad they are or how wrong they are. And these feelings and these concepts are, I think, what's largely people that are not educated about addiction are generally unaware of. Most people think, well, he's a drunk. He needs to quit drinking. If he quit drinking, everything would straighten out. But they don't realize that the reason that he's a drunk is that he didn't know how to deal with stuff when he was in grade school. He was sexually abused. He watched dad beat up mom. These things happened, or there's been alcoholism in the family for 10 generations on both sides, and there's a lot of pain and suffering there. So a lot of what we're doing long-term as therapists is first we ideally get them to stop using, but then we very quickly need to help them become more competent in identifying and dealing with these feelings. And 12-step stuff is very helpful with that. Tommy? You got?
Yes, thanks. With respect to the sectionality of trauma and depression, when do you address trauma?
When do you address trauma when dealing with addicts? The honest and I think skillful answer to that, Tommy, is always.
Yes. I guess my question
Yeah.
is more about the when.
Well, and I mean always. So basically, as a therapist, I always want to be conscious of either the potentiality that's there and I don't know about it yet, or it's been disclosed to me, and so I know that it's there, and when is the appropriate time to be encouraging it to come up. Now, what'll happen is oftentimes you don't get a choice. It's there and you got to deal with it. When I have my choice, I do not dive in and say, let's tell me about what happened when you were 4. Tell me what happened when you were 8, 12, 18. I generally don't do that until a person has some foundation in recovery, because these feelings are very powerful. There's often memories that are not in the consciousness yet that will come up that can tip things over. So I don't want to go digging until there's enough support and structure to hold the person and keep them safe as those things are coming up. A lot of what is called recovery is dealing with the emotional fallout of those things, and also dealing with being black in our society, being woman in our society, and being treated as second-class citizens, and the impact that it has before, now, and in the future. Is how do I develop the ability to deal with that skillfully? It's always there, and with each person it's going to be somewhat different, and sometimes it's going to be a total surprise.
I was thinking about that in respect to, in my humble opinion, sometimes the system is a trigger.
Uh-huh.
The trauma.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah.
How to maximize engagement and avoid pain.
Oh, one of the big things to do is to acknowledge that. I have worked with plenty of people that are on probation or parole, working with men and women that are in the system with Child Protective and DSS, which is not always a lovely situation to be in. And being able to ally with people and let them know that they're wanting to kill themselves or kill everybody else makes perfect sense, rather than it's just another way they're screwed up. That their perceptions that somebody isn't as caring or as competent as they are. It really can help create a connection with the client that helps make it possible for them to get through that. Yes?
I was just going to say that I found that one of the things that helps is when you tell an addicted person that if they're using, they can still call you, they can still have that connection to you before getting into trouble. And
Right.
sometimes people are astounded and they've had the traumatic experience of being told, don't talk to me anymore. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. I've had people shoot up in my bathroom. I mean, stuff happens, and you work with it the best you can. Fear, self-centered fear. I don't know if it's on this one or the next one. One of the things they say somewhere in the AA literature is alcoholism, addiction is about self-centered fear. Addiction isn't about doing too much heroin or too much booze or having sex with the wrong people. Addiction is about self-centered fear, fear of not getting something you want or losing something you have. I will grant that that can be an oversimplification, but I think it's a profound concept, and I think it's real. And another thing they say in that literature is that the addict is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. I think I actually have this on a later slide. The addict is an egomaniac with an inferiority complex. Interesting concept. I am both better and worse than everybody. I am other. No one understands me. I don't want to go hang out with those people, and they would never have me as a friend. It's a problem. And finally, addiction is a disease of isolation. Where when somebody's feeling lonely, they'll go off to be by themselves. Not helpful. What they call the fellowship of the 12-step programs helps deal with that last one, with the isolation thing. It helps deal with the egomania and the inferiority. And most of the work has to do with shifting out of the habitual fear. Yeah.
Something that we come up with clients, a lot of them either genuine introverts
Yep.
or have some sort of social anxiety. How do you deal with that without isolating, but also respecting, some people are just introverts?
Right, and actually, quite honestly, the research shows that 12-step stuff is more effective with people that are not introverts, people that are verbal and things like that. So it is a problem. And one of the things about the whole 12-step, if you can encourage a person to go, well, one of the things that I always do is I prep people for going to their meetings. Quite often I will arrange for them to have a young man or a young woman or an older guy or gal take people to their first meetings. Some people don't want that. Sometimes it can't be arranged. But if that's not arranged, what I let people know is the format of meetings, how they go, and the fact that they don't have to do anything or say anything. I forewarn them at the beginning of the meeting. Somebody will probably ask, the chair of the meeting will probably ask, are there any newcomers? And I let them know, you do not have to raise your hand. If you you do not have to say you're an addict or an alcoholic. If somebody, there's different formats for 12-step meetings. Some are speaker meetings. In large cities, there are more speaker meetings than any other types. In Ithaca, most meetings are called discussion meetings. There may be anywhere from 5 to 60 or 70 people. There'll be a chairperson. The chair people volunteer. There's really no rank or hierarchy in the 12-step stuff. So somebody's volunteered to chair, they'll read a format, they'll read the steps, they'll read the traditions, they'll ask if there's any newcomers, any out-of-town visitors. If there's a newcomer, would you introduce yourself by your first name? And I might add, so we can get to know you, not to embarrass you, something like that. But I tell people, you do not have to raise your hand. And then I forewarn them, if somebody comes up to you and says, hi, because I didn't recognize you, and all of a sudden you're outed as being new, there's a good chance they'll talk about the first step. And half the people in the room, out of ignorance, will address you in their sharing. It makes people want to crawl into a hole. And I let them know that there's still nothing they need to do, and if they need to, they can leave. I also recommend that it's not everybody recommends this. It's involved in 12-step stuff. To show up a few minutes early and stay a few minutes after. I say, they say 10 minutes, for people that I'm trying to get there the first time. I say, show up a minute or two before. And if you can, make yourself stay a minute or two after. But I'm very clear that they do not have to say anything, and they don't have to adopt a new identity as an addict of any sort. And I've had miracles of people that they go in, they sit in the back row, and they don't open their mouth for 6 months or a year, and then they do, and you can't shut them up. And there's others that simply, it's like, I'm introverted, I'll come, I'll hang out with people, it's very helpful, and I really don't want to have anything else to do with you because I'm really uncomfortable in my own skin still. And hopefully they'll get a sponsor or a couple people to hang out with. And whether that happens varies. But it's a good place to take a break.